Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's web conference Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Please note that all participant lines will be muted until the Q&A portions of the call. If you would like to ask a question, please press #2 on your telephone keypad. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please then state your name and question. If you require technical assistance, send a note to the event producer. With that, I'll turn the call over to Dr. Benjamin Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Roy. Welcome, everybody. With me are Jim Bushnell and Scott Harvey, members of the MSC. We have a chock-full agenda with 4 different items. There was a lot of Control V's being hit as this agenda was put together because we see Guillermo is up not once, not twice, but thrice. Thank you, Guillermo, for all your hard work on the presentations. And he'll be discussing in turn real-time pricing and analysis of real-time prices, price formation issues, and then subsequently this morning CRRs, how's the new system been performing, and then early in the afternoon following up on DMM recommendations and their report. We'll be talking about system-wide market power early in the afternoon. And finally, Guillermo gets the break. Chris Devon replaces him, and we'll be talking about resource adequacy enhancements. That agenda item will be focusing on treatment of import bids, but there are many other moving pieces on that initiative. I believe there have been more stakeholder comments on that than any other initiative I've ever seen, Part 1 and Part 2 together. So you'll be seeing a lot more and other topics from that in subsequent MSC meetings. But before we get to any of that fun, we're first going to see if there's any public comment on, preferably on issues other than the 4 that will be covered today. And I'm looking around the room, and everybody's looking at their hands. Nobody's raising their hand to say they want to say anything. Is there any public comment within the room on any other issue? If not, operator, can you see if there's anybody on the lines who would like to make a public comment at this time? Hearing none. Roy, are you there?
There are no hands raised over the phone line.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll, the next housekeeping item, we have a decision on general session minutes, and in front of us we have, I believe, 4 or 3 sets of minutes. We have four minutes. Let's see. There were 3 teleconferences during which MSC opinions were adopted this last winter. In addition, there was a general session meeting on January 25th here in Folsom. And we can consider them one at a time, but I would also entertain a motion to approve all of them. But I need a motion.
I move we approve the minutes from January 5, March 5, March 20.
I second. Okay. It's been moved and seconded that those 4 sets of minutes be accepted. Any discussion, corrections? No. If not, then I'll take a vote. Dr. Harvey?
Yes.
Dr. Bushnell?
Yes.
And I vote yes. So the 4 sets of minutes from January 18th and 25th and March 5th and 20th have been accepted. So at this point, Dr. Batista, it is all yours.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to go through these different topics that we are going to cover in the agenda today. And I just hope my voice is going to last long enough to go through the end. And the first topic I would like to introduce is related to the pricing discussion we have had so far. And let me give you the context and the objective of this part, because as you are going to see, this is not going to be a very technical discussion, because what I'm bringing to you right now is a plan. Historically, we have had these concerns of price formation in our markets, and the term price formation may be used loosely, but in general, the concern has been more about price divergence, prices not reflecting the system conditions. And in the last iteration that we had in the discussion of the initiative about intertype deviation, there were more concerns about the same line of price divergence, pricing performance. What we committed to is to take on a more formal process and engage participants through that process in order to analyze and understand what is happening with our pricing in the California ISOs markets. And markets meaning the energy market. We are not to be reaching far enough into the CRR market. This is going to be confined to the day-ahead and real-time market pricing concerns. We made this commitment and we have a plan. Specifically, we want to go through different stages. And one of the feedback that we got from participants is that they want to be actively engaged in what the plan is going to be and how we are going to approach and what the scope is going to be about this analysis. This is the reason we're coming first with you to discuss and see what other areas you may consider to be important and key to take on this analysis. And we also posted a paper that is early this week available on the website, and it contains some background, why we are here, what areas we want to touch, and what specific areas we want to analyze to come to the conclusion of the analysis by the end of July. This is really where we're coming from. What we're bringing to you today is a discussion of what we want to do rather than the very specifics of how we are going to do it. And this has to do, obviously, a lot with the current market structure and design that we have in the system. We have this market that is a multi-step market going from the day-ahead market into the real-time market. There are linkages between the day-ahead moving into the real-time. There are awards and schedules that are financially binding in the day-ahead market. Some schedules, some decisions that are made in the day-ahead market become financially binding, operational binding for the real-time market. Once we move into the real-time market, the same logic remains. There are linkages between the 15-minute market moving into the 5-minute market. Some of those may create some incentives and some arbitrage opportunities. And over the years, we have been tackling those divergences between the markets. Specifically, the areas that have been historically problematic has to do with when we move from one market to the other. For instance, we have this standard protocol of a multi-step settlements. We go into the day-ahead market, it's fully financially binding, we fully settle on that market. Then as we progress into the real-time market, we start settling the differences with respect to the previous market. The 15-minute market settles against the day-ahead market. Then the 5-minute market settles against the 15-minute market. And we create schedules, awards across the market, and therefore we also have prices. There are some specific rules that have very nice features in terms of how this market coordinates. For instance, we have the HASP market that we still use to clear on an hourly basis the interties for those that are hourly resources. Those determine basically the schedules that are going to be binding. However, when we have to go and settle those schedules, we have to rely on the 15-minute prices. And things happen between the time we run the HASP market to the time we run the FMM market that is going to be producing the financially binding prices. There may be some specific feature designs that apply to the HASP market that may not be naturally applied to the 15-minute market. For instance, some items that we have investigated currently in the intertie area has to do with releasing or holding the transmission rights. There are some specific transmission rights that participants can hold through HASP. And even if they don't use it, we cannot use that capacity. It has to be reserved. Once we move into the 15-minute market, if they don't use it, now we release it. It may happen that this dynamic alone is creating a price divergence because in the HASP market, we account for that capacity as reserve. Now we go and release it in FMM, and now the constraint is not binding. That alone is an item that we have already identified to be a cause. There may be other dynamics, for instance, that has to do more with the operational side of the equation, and that is another item that we just recently found. We have this in-kind type of accounting for losses between our balancing area and another area. When we have to do that, that doesn't come first to the HASP market. It goes straight into the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market. Right there, you have now some capacity that is not accounted between the two markets, between HASP and FMN. That is going to create a discrepancy between the markets, and obviously it's going to be reflected on prices. These are the specific cases that we have to tackle to account for some operational conditions, or just because of the timing of the markets. At the end of the day, all these features play a role in how the price convergence is playing out between the HASP and FMM and RTD. The other complication has to do on its own by the fact that we have different horizons as we run the different markets. By the time we start running the 15-minute market that includes the HASP market, that has a lookout of about 37 minutes in advance. By the time now we have to run the RTD market in 5-minute basis, that is a lookout of 7.5 minutes. A lot of things may happen in that window. So we are running well ahead the 15-minute market, and 30 minutes later we start running the RTD. In this 30-minute window, things happen and change. This natural timing is going to create inconsistencies potentially between the markets that at the end may result in this price divergence. And obviously, some of those changes have to do with what we have to do in order to align the actual system conditions with what the market is observing. And that is through the market intervention, through the market operator actions that we have to have across the market. Many of these things are not brand new. Many of these topics have been subject to debate. They have been a concern historically from market participants, and we track to some extent that type of concerns. We haven't done enough to capture all this together and try to do something more formal and more comprehensive. Many of the metrics that we have, to some extent, try to show the dynamics, the patterns, the trends over time. And I can tell you up front that I'm not a big fan of using averages to make conclusions, and what I'm going to show you is basically the set of metrics that we historically have shown. I'm not telling you these are the metrics we are going to continue to use for this specific type of analysis. It's just to give you a nutshell of information of what we already see in our end. And one of the metrics that we have obviously is price convergence, how well the prices are moving across markets. And this has been a factor that has been discussed sporadically in our market performance forum meetings. We know that by practical experience, the day-ahead prices have been higher than the real-time prices. Or it could be characterized the other way around, that the real-time prices have been lower than the day-ahead markets. And there are a lot of theories what is behind, and obviously there are many moving pieces. The expectation of this analysis is to be able to put apart these little pieces on its own and try to do the analysis exactly to what extent they influence the price formation in our markets. And one of the caveats I want to throw here is that I don't want to refer to this effort to be in general a price formation effort, because there are many things that can be put in this basket of price formation. We are not expecting to go after price formation of pricing fast start units, for instance. That is more narrow in the sense of price performance, and that is the reason we changed a little bit the title of this presentation. So this has been, to some extent, a very basic picture to realize that there is some price performance concerns in our market. And obviously you can play with this metric in different fashions, do monthly averages, do it through the hourly profile, and still the picture is there telling you that there is price divergence happening in our markets. That is not new. The piece that we want to take on is to go deeper into understanding why is causing this type of systematic price divergence.
And before going on to this, so the system-wide ones on page, I guess that was 3, no, this page, 2017 looked very different with day-ahead prices not being higher than 15-minute prices, et cetera. So yeah, you'd have to take a multi-year look.
Yes, and this is actually a very good point, because I think the natural option for us would be to rely on 2018, that is the most recent performance, things have changed, things have evolved over time, and the question would be how meaningful would it be to go beyond the most recent, the previous year, to draw conclusions when things have already changed. And another point on here is that obviously this is just a sample of a metric based on system marginal prices. There is a bigger question here whether it's going to be enough just to go into the marginal component, whether we have to go and try to capture the congestion component using the labs, trading hubs, etc. Within this picture, I think we have to acknowledge that looking at the system-wide is going to be good enough to understand the overall dynamics, but still we have to be more targeted towards the interplay and pricing that is happening on the interties, because there are specific features that make interties a little bit different than the rest of the system. So part of the scope of this effort is to make sure that we are going to spend a good deal of time analyzing more specifically the dynamics of the interties. And this is to address basically many of the concerns that you raised through the last opinion that you gave us on the intertie settlement deviation. So we have this set of items in our list to be able to address through this policy, through this analysis effort. Okay, now let me give you the background of how we landed on what we want to propose for analysis in this effort. At the end of the day, we want to target price performance. The price at the end of the day is going to be a reflection of the dynamics of the market. It could be the effect, but not the cost. There are two variables at play that determine what the prices are going to be. You have the basic principle, supply equals demand. Each piece can have an effect on the clearing price. You move the demand, you move the price. You move the supply, you move the price. So we have to look at both sides in order to target exactly what is happening. And it could be factors that play a role in both sides of the equation. On one end, we want to tackle what is happening on the demand side. When we refer to the market, it depends what market we are talking about. If we're talking about the day-ahead market, for instance, specifically the integrated forward market, the financial market, we are really simply talking about the bidding demand in general. Well, there are more components that make a factor into what the market actually clears against the supply. Yes, load forecast, bidding demand is a big component, but it's not the only component that plays a role of what the market at the end has to clear against. Yes.
Hi, Guillermo. Dean Burke with CVWR. In your slide there it says exports, pumps. Can you be more specific on what you mean by pumps?
Yes. We have specific resources in our system. I would say there are two types of pumps. The ones that can operate as either pumps or generators, like health units, right? They are modeled explicitly in such a way that we can take advantage of the pump mode or the generation mode. When we clear the market, and if the market is clearing those specific resources in the pump mode, they become effectively demand to the system. So you have to have supply to meet that additional demand.
So you refer to those pumps as pump storage model resources? Or?
That is one type of resources. We do have other type of resources that are purely basically pumps, and they effectively act like loads. Many of those are CDWR. Okay, what I was indicating is that depending on the market, what makes up the demand side has to do with that market in specific. When we go, for instance, into the rock market, the path after the financial market, we have to clear against the load forecast, because the premise of the rock was to ensure that after we clear the financial market, we have enough capacity committed to make sure that we can support the forecasted load. This is the first place where markets can be adjusted. The demand clearing the integrated forward market is just the bidding demand. There is no operator action that can adjust that amount. But when we move into the rock market, indeed, operators can actually adjust the load forecast because they see certain conditions, they are projecting certain conditions that the current solution or the current forecast is not giving them. So that adjustment can be actually up or down. And when either of those adjustments happen, effectively we are changing the amount of demand that has to be met, with the supply. This is what we refer as a ROC adjustment to the market. The consequence of this is that once we have cleared the integrated forward market, we come to the ROC market, and now we have this additional capacity. That capacity potentially may show up in the real-time market. And that capacity was not priced within the integrated forward market. It's coming after the financial market is clear. When we move into the real-time market, the dynamic is quite similar. Now in the real-time market, we are clearing against the forecast. Again, the forecast is just one of the components that make up the final requirement that the market is going to clear against the supply. Other components for the real-time market, for instance, include obviously the load conformance adjustment. That is additional or less capacity that we have to put to clear in the market. We have the system losses. When you have a peak day, for instance, in the range of 50,000 megawatts, losses alone are going to be about 1,000 megawatts. That is 1,000 megawatts that have to clear against the supply. And these are the different components that play a role in what the demand has to be for the market to clear against. And if there is an opportunity or the mechanism for adjusting those values, obviously that is going to have an influence of what the clearing price is going to be. One of the explicit components that we acknowledge that has a role in the clearing process has to do with the operator interventions. We have a market that is running in different time frames. We have an operator that the primary responsibility is to make sure that the reliable operation of the system is in place. Ideally, we want to use the market as the mechanism to dispatch and operate the system. However, the last resort is the operator. When there is a discrepancy between what the market is clearing against versus what the operators actually see in the system, they need to true up the market. The market, because of the timing, because of the information it has, may not be able to see or react soon enough to capture these actual system conditions. It is here where the operator has the last resort to be able to true up this and erase that gap. What options, what tools the operator have at hand to be able to true up the market versus the system? One is to obviously adjust the demand side, but counterwise, they can also adjust the supply side. And when it comes to the supply side, there are more options than on the demand side. On one end, they can actually request units to follow a specific instruction that may not have naturally been in place in the market. That could be as simple as calling a unit to come online, calling a unit to reach a specific target point in the operation range. And this is what we call the exceptional dispatches. It's just dispatches outside the economics of the market to ensure that that capacity, that RAM capability is going to be there. We have a series of different metrics to capture the volume, the trends, the reasons for that exceptional dispatches. A slightly different flavor of those exceptional dispatches are the manual dispatches on the interties. Mechanically similar, basically is to find what energy is available on specific interties and see if that capacity can come into the market. The dynamics of the manual dispatches on the interties may be slightly different to the internal resources, and that has to do again with the timing. As long as the market is able to see the information, the market is going to internalize that information and able to dispatch the market accordingly. The problem becomes with the timing of internalizing those instructions. If you have, for instance, a case of a manual dispatch of an intertie, that is going to happen typically after you have cleared for that HASP hour. Therefore, the market, the HASP that cleared the hourly interties, could not see that capacity. Now, once we have cleared the HASP market, we have this manual dispatch, and now the energy is going to come through the tagging system. That ideally could come in the second interval of the 15-minute market for that hour, depending how fast the tagging takes place. It sometimes may be missed for the first two intervals of the FMM. Typically, and for sure, it's going to be in the third and the fourth interval of the hour in the FMM market. It's going to be typically in all the intervals of the RTD market. There could be, again, depending on the timing, some opportunity for discrepancy between the HASP, the FMM, and the RTD to see those manual dispatches on the interties. And this obviously is going to create a discrepancy of what energy is used to balance the system, because if you have X amount of energy coming from an intertie that only one market was able to see, that energy is going to display somehow economically other capacity that is in the market, and it can create this price divergence between one market and the other. There are also other type of actions the operators may take in order to reconcile and true up the market with the actual system conditions. And this is what I generically classify as blocking of instructions. The operators have the ability and the responsibility at the end to make sure that the instructions that go out make sense and are keeping the reliability of the system. Operators can actually block startups, shutdowns, transitions to align what they see against the actual system. The dynamic that this may create is that when you have a market that, let's say, determined to be optimal the shutdown for one resource, that market cleared based on the assumption that that resource is not going to be longer in the system. It's going to be offline, and therefore it doesn't contribute to the balancing of the system. When the operator, for X reason, determines that that instruction is going to be blocked and therefore the shutdown is not going to materialize, the subsequent intervals are going to continue to see that resource now as online. Still, the market that already determined the shutdown price that action accordingly. Now you may have a discrepancy of prices between the market that determined the unit to be shut down with the subsequent markets that continue to see the unit online. And that may happen for any type of instructions, start, shutdowns, transitions. The other type of blocking that we have is about a specific operating targets. In some cases, a bad data input may come into the system. Let's say for some reason the forecast didn't come clean and just shoots to the sky. Operators know that they cannot let that instructions to go out because it's not reflective of the system conditions. It was introduced with the noise of a bad data input. Well, they need to have the mechanism to be able to block that instruction and not send crazy dispatches out there. They can go and block the whole set of instructions. They can go and targetedly block some instructions to realign the expectation of the system conditions with what the market is doing. Again, when the market clears for that type of instructions, it's clearing at a price that accounts for that specific instructions. If that instruction is blocked, subsequent markets are going to realize that that capacity is there or is not there, depending on what was blocked. And again, that is going to create a potential discrepancy between the current market and the subsequent market. Yes, Mark.
Hi, Guillermo. It's Mark Smith of Calpine. When an operator blocks an instruction, the generator would never know that, right? They simply would not get a transition notice, or they would not get an instruction that had been blocked.
Yeah,
right?
Because they are basically, the action is taken before the results go out. So let's say...
Right, so there's no electronic or verbal communication.
There is no data point that tells you whether the instruction was blocked or not from the operators, from the generator's point of view. If you have a dispatch operating target from the previous interval, and typically we're going to block an instruction, the blocking basically means keep where you were in the previous interval, and they will just see a flat line at that point.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Is it coming through?
Are we waiting on the question on the phone?
Yes, please.
Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Guillermo. Good morning. This is Weizhou from SCE. I have a question or probably a comment on your previous slide when you were mentioning the bidding demand for the IFM. To me, in IFM market prices could also be impacted by their low forecast. I do understand that IFM clears against the bidding demand, but because the energy and ancillary service are co-optimized in IFM, so if you have over forecast in the day-ahead market, that's going to set a higher requirement for ancillary services procurement. That could in turn, impact energy prices in IFM. I think that this has been observed in previous years. When the days when there are heat wave and there may be some over forecast in the day-ahead market. So I just want to comment on that.
Sure, that's a very good point. I would call this to be a secondary or collateral effect on the forecast, and yes, that's a fair point.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Wei.
Do you have anybody else? Okay.
We have no further questions over the phone.
Okay. I think for the last couple of years, load conformance adjustments have been a very frequent topic in the discussions of the market performance, and we have recently some initiatives that touch in this area, and we acknowledge that this is effectively a meaningful component in the performance of the real-time market, and this is going to be naturally one of the main areas that we have to analyze, and not just understand that there is this much conformance in the system, but the next step. What is the effect of having that amount of conformance in the specific market? And this just gives you a snapshot of how the conformance has been playing for 2018 across the different months of the year. And you can see there are some trends, and the Department of Market Monitoring has been closely tracking this, and there are some trending across the day, across the months, and this is nothing new, but some information that we have already discussed in the past. And obviously it's going to be one of the key components that we are going to analyze in this effort. All the data that is shown here is 2018, yes. Another component obviously is the exceptional dispatches because of the implications that this has in adjusting the supply stack in the market. Anytime you have exceptional dispatches, naturally you're going to be inserting energy capacity into the bid stack that may displace the clearing point, upward or downward depending on the nature of the exceptional dispatch. And again, the exceptional dispatch I think is one of the most reported metrics that we have in our systems. We have many different reports from all angles about exceptional dispatches. I think the piece that now we have to undertake is effectively what is the effect of that on the price that has been where we have been lagging a little bit.
Want to comment on any of those categories?
Yeah. Let me take Mark's question and then I can go on to that. Yes, Mark.
Thanks, Guillermo. It's Mark Smith again. So the chart at the top right, that shows both exceptional dispatches and manual intertie dispatch volumes together?
Yes.
Okay. And if I read that top number in July, it's close to 400,000 gigawatt hours for the month. Is that about right?
Let me see if I can see better the number here.
It's a big number, I guess, is my point.
Yeah.
In a simple correlation of those really big numbers to the differences that you showed in day ahead to real time is very, very high, it seems.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, point taken.
Yeah.
And I think, again, this is volumes, this is the total energy, right? And what we want to do is not just stay on the surface of what the metrics shows at the great picture, but boil down into the specifics of how this is really playing out in the more little detail.
Yeah, and I know that you show this metric a lot. You show exceptional dispatch as a percent of total load, and you do that routinely in the market planning forums, which we appreciate. But I think it would be helpful, given this analysis, if you showed exceptional dispatches and intertie volumes as a percentage of imbalance energy that's dispatched in real time or 15-minute markets.
Yeah.
Because I think those percentages might reveal some very interesting trends.
Sure, point taken. And let me just put an advertisement here. We post this paper that contains some of these metrics, and we're scheduled to have a call next week. And we are also seeking feedback from participants through comments. So I would appreciate that if there is any area where you believe that there is a need to go further or do a specific type of analysis of area that we are missing, that you put those in the written comments so that we can really capture all those.
I'd like to explore Mark's point a little bit more. So this is showing the 400,000 is equivalent to roughly 500 megawatts in every hour, right? If we divide by about 800 hours. So that's a lot. So this is exceptional dispatch, so you're trying to get more energy into the real-time market. Yet page 5, which shows July and August, it shows that day-ahead prices are much higher than real-time prices. So is this suggesting a cause and effect that there's a lot of exceptional dispatch in real time, and that might be bringing real-time prices down relative to day-ahead prices?
I think that has been a theory out there that obviously when you clear the IFM market, it's just clearing against the bidding demand, right? Then after that market, you come with additional capacity that was not in the consideration of the IFM market, and now you have abundant generation available in the real-time market that may depress the prices now consequently in the real time. That has been a theory that has some practical evidence that may be happening. This is what we need to go deeper and really try to quantify to what extent that is true.
Okay. Be interesting to see what's going on in RUC and the day-ahead RUC in those markets, the day-ahead forecast too low, but then why would that result in low prices? Does stuff get RUC'd, but not enough?
Yeah. And let me throw another factor, because, again, it goes to the point where you have too many moving pieces. One of the cases, for instance, that we have, I believe it was last summer, was when we have an over forecast in the day-ahead market, and I think it was in the range of 3,000 megawatts. When you go and clear against that, and then you come to the real-time market and you have that less capacity, obviously now you have potentially too much capacity already made available to the real time, and you have 3,000 megawatts less of load to meet, right? So it's a matter of dissecting all these moving pieces.
And that wouldn't be consistent with the exceptional dispatch story, but of course both could be happening on different, you have one happen in one day, have a lot of exceptional dispatch to the other forecast, and then what you just described happens on a different one.
Yeah, and this is the injustice when you just look at averages, right? Because it just hides all this type of information.
Yeah. Could you explain, you've got that big area about the amount of exceptional dispatch based on load forecast uncertainty.
Yes.
But why, is this the amount of energy that's dispatched, or is it just capacity that's committed?
This is based on, I believe it's the volume already dispatched.
But I don't understand why you'd have to dispatch it for load forecast uncertainty. I can see why that would require RTPD to commit additional units, but then RTD should dispatch that capacity. I don't understand why we have to exceptionally dispatch.
Oh, no, sorry, let me characterize. I misunderstood the question. This includes all the energy that was eventually dispatched and belongs to exceptional dispatches. Some of those may be indeed additional commitments that we have to make into the real time because otherwise the market didn't bring those units online.
Okay, so then maybe there was only 50 megawatts of capacity that was actually committed, minimum load capacity that was exceptional dispatch, and the rest of it was dispatched in merit, or the operator is dispatching the energy out of merit. I mean, it's a big difference which is happening, because with just a little bit of extra capacity that's getting committed, that's a small impact on the market. But if there are 600 megawatts being dispatched, as Ben said, that's a lot.
Yeah, and I can tell you practically, I recall a few cases where once we completed the day-ahead market, we knew that we needed more capacity that the day-ahead market didn't give us, and we moved forward with the exceptional dispatching the commitment of additional units. That alone is
necessarily going to lead to a low. Put the unit on and let it be dispatched.
Yes.
Yeah,
we can take it.
go ahead and put the caller through?
Okay. Caller, go ahead. Your line has been unmuted.
Hey, Guillermo. This is Colby Kettler with VTEL. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you.
Good, good. Hey, I want to go back real quick to kind of the defining of what you're looking at here, price formation versus price performance. Just a real quick comment, and I'm hoping that this isn't the case, but it seems that an action or something of that nature could be leading to price formation issues, which subsequently could be leading to what would be considered an opinion as price performance well within a range of a decent price performance. So you could actually still have relevant price formation issues fundamentally within the market and still causing still incorrect signals, but within what might be considered parameters that you guys consider price performance. I guess I'm cautious myself, but I'm caution this type of approach to analysis versus really diving into price formation issues and not focusing or therefore not really diving into the price formation issues because you're actually seeing what might be considered price performance, acceptable price performance. Does that make sense?
I hear you. I'm still failing to see the difference between one or the other. But let me answer with this. This is precisely the reason why we want to have the discussion with participants and with MSC, just to see what should the scope of the effort be. And we are quite open to hear you and take into account your feedback and see what areas we would specifically have to analyze and tackle on this effort. So if you have a very specific area that you believe should be part of this effort, please submit those through the written comments and we will be happy to have a discussion how we are going to address those.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I just, just starting off and thinking about this, I just want to be very careful because you can still have actions and or, with respect to what is being done in the marketplace and therefore having price formation issues, but essentially having price performance, acceptable price performance by the ISO, but still out of market pricing, incorrect signals, all of those types of things, like penalty pricing on the interties as it relates to the HAS market could be one of them. It might, at the end of the day, in the 15-minute market, produce what they would consider is price performance, but it also is incorrect with the interties to cut schedules, at a $1,000 penalty price, but then show 20% of that price in the 15-minute market. So I just hope that we don't really miss real price formation issues based on considering the outcomes or the actions justified with real price performance, is all I'm saying.
Okay, thank you, Kobe. I think you are just on time to be able to shape and help us on defining the analysis that we need to do so.
Absolutely.
I want to beat that horse a little more as I thought about it. Now, the operators are putting in load conformance in RTPD, so that should be forcing more units on anyway to deal with the load that we see. So when we're talking about the exceptional dispatch, you're committing extra units. This is beyond what RTD is committed. So they're putting in an extra 2,000 megawatts of load without the higher load forecast in there, and then they're even on top of that saying we need to commit other units beyond that.
It could happen, yes.
But I mean, that's what's 600. I mean, the load forecast certainly that's several hundred megawatts of that. That seems like a lot. If that's really just what's being put on in addition to load conformance, in addition to what RTPD is doing.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, this is Steve. With the exceptional dispatch coming after the day-ahead market and before the real-time, the units that are being exceptionally dispatched, were they bidding into real-time? Or, were they bidding into the IFM, or were they exceptionally dispatched after not being in IFM?
I wouldn't answer in a general fashion because I don't know if there could be cases of either one, whether they bid in the market and then they were not committed or whether they were not in the market. So I wouldn't put a general answer.
And I guess then the other question is if they, well, even either way, how, if they were in IFM but weren't dispatched in IFM, why weren't they dispatched in IFM? And then, so what are the impacts that that's having when they are exceptionally dispatched? Was it because their energy bid was too high, or their startup value, the startup bid was too high, or, why is it that they didn't make it in the market, but then they are exceptionally dispatched?
Yeah. I would say when this sequence of events come, the question is not really about whether they were bidding too high or too low. It's what the operators see as the final pool of resources that are going to be available for next day, and what they believe based on the projected conditions that they need to. When they see the resource and say, oh, why the market is giving me this pool of resources when I'm going to have a 50,000 day and I feel I'm going to be short, I feel I'm not going to be able to go through the run. Well, let me go and make sure that I'm not going to be in that position. So it's not a matter of whether it was too expensive or too cheap to be committed. It's what they effectively see to be positioning for the real time.
Right, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is, these units weren't committed by the market, but then the operators are saying we need them. I'm just trying to see, to figure out to some extent the effect that they would have had on price. If they've been committed in the market, what would the price have been? And I guess, there are other questions such as, okay, if they had been committed by the market, would the market have committed the same total amount, just different resources, or do the operators think that they need more? And I guess another question that I would have is this, is when are these exceptional dispatches happening? Are they happening, after the IFM, but well before the HASP or RTD starts, or are they happening, after HASP or, kind of right at the time HASP is going on?
Yeah. Again, I don't know if there are any cases of one type or the other. I can tell you practically, and in the recent past, we have this discussion internally, and I know by fact that there is a specific timing that we have to address. If there is a resource, for instance, that we know that has to be in the system because of X reason, ideally, the first option is going to be if we can take that resource into account when clearing the market. So if we know well in advance that that resource is going to be needed, we may actually try to put it in the day-ahead market to be part of the IFM solution, such that you can naturally take into account that capacity in the clearing process. So there may be one or two cases in the recent past where we have done that because they know in advance that that is a resource needed, and therefore once you take into account that that resource has to be in the market is going to solve around that.
Right, but that's not what's showing up. That wouldn't show up in these numbers, right? Because these are just what's going on in real time.
It will. In this case, because we are taking an action out of the market, we force it to be in the day-ahead market. We make sure that the tracking is still in place so that it shows as an exception dispatch.
So this could include units that were cleared in the IFM. Not very helpful.
That's kind of where I was looking at. I was assuming that this was just stuff that was cleared after the day-ahead market, because if they're making that adjustment before, then it shouldn't be causing the price problem should be dealt with. I mean, that's essentially.
Oh, no, yeah, and that is the whole point to try to put it in the market that we know, right? Because once it's in the market is going to clear only what we need to take into account that capacity already in the system.
Right. I mean, that's essentially like the ISO making just doing a thing, this is going to run. It's just like when a generator or, somebody comes in and says, yeah, okay, I'm going to run this one no matter what. That's essentially the same thing, right? It should work its way through the market, and that shouldn't really, because, it'll cause price impacts, but they should be in the IFM, they shouldn't show up as a discrepancy between them.
Yeah, I think this specific case, by the fact that it's going to be internalized in the IFM market, is going to have a less effect on the pricing because that capacity is already accounted for. The cases where we bring resources after the IFM market clear is the ones that are going to most likely create the discrepancy because this is capacity that was not seen in the IFM market.
So out of the big number in July and August, what percent of that was what you just described, where it's done before the IFM runs?
hold a little bit for when we start getting the results. I don't have a metric to tell you in front. I have the feeling based on the day-to-day production that we go through that this is a small portion of the whole picture. It's not happening something very, very frequently, but it may happen. Okay.
I mean, it seems like, you know, the load forecast certainty wouldn't be something you'd commit units in the IFM for. But maybe I was wondering why you had planned transmission outages, but that would make sense because planned transmission outages you would have known about, so maybe those would be modeled in the IFM.
Yes, and this is really all the type of questions we have to go through the analysis per se. And again, this just gives you a big picture of the volume, the amount of exceptional dispatches. The devil is in the details. We really have to go and boil down into what really happened in different cases. And this is part of the whole effort that we want to do through this analysis. Now, let me just clarify something here because this is something that we explicitly discussed back in July, September timeframe. Obviously, there is a concern when you see this big beam in blue that refers to load uncertainty. We have a discussion actually with some of the participants from our forum that we realize you have to put yourself a little bit on the operator's mode, right? When they have to go and go through this. Conveniently, they were picking one reason to basically classify the exceptional dispatches, when in reality it was not just load uncertainty. For instance, I remember very well the day of July 24th, our peak day. They were putting many exceptional dispatches as just load uncertainty, when in reality there were uncertainties related to other conditions. One of them was, for instance, uncertainty related to fire. There were fires, and they were trying to bring units to make sure that if they dropped lines, they would have the movement and redispatch needed in the system. Still, it was classified as load uncertainty. After we discussed this in the corresponding market performance forum meeting, we have a discussion internally, and now they have more groups to define more closely the exceptional dispatches, because obviously it can be deceiving at that point if they just use one placeholder for different reasons.
Hey, Guillermo. Etienne Brooks, CDWR. So your market disruption reports are split the month, they're not like the full month as you report here. Is there any effort on the SO's part to just make them a full month so the explanation of these types of exceptional dispatches align better with the way you report this data? And then, so load forecasting uncertainties from the day ahead, the CAISO forecast of CAISO demand versus what appears in real time, and then load pull is just any other load that, what's the difference between those two, I guess?
Again, I wouldn't like to generalize with an answer because it may be a matter of how they are picking the reason to log the dispatch. I think moving forward they are going to be more targeted to capture the real reason. And you may have misclassifications of the exceptional dispatches here.
Guillermo, I can jump in and try to answer that question. And again, this is just more of a general from my time as an operator. And I think Guillermo classifying this as, this is Megan Pogue from the ISO, but I think Guillermo classifying this that there's normally multiple things going on for the conformance is absolutely true, but the main difference between the load forecast uncertainty is that the operators are seeing the actual load come in different, and this could be in day ahead or in real time than what we forecasted. Load pull, I believe, means to the steep ramp in the evening and might also tie into ramp feasibility. So one of the things we identified in the Day Ahead Market Enhancements Initiative is that our hourly ramp right now might be feasible, but our ramps within 15 minutes might not be feasible. And that is one of the reasons that the operators may be biasing to get additional commitment so that we have 15-minute ramp feasible. The hourly ramp is feasible, but the 15-minute ramp might not be. And that could be contributing to what this load pull is talking about.
Yeah, and that worries me because that's why we have FlexiRamp, so that there'd be enough ramp. And then since FlexiRamp still doesn't work after 2.5 years, the operators have to put more units on, which we know isn't really always effective in solving the problem. So we get back to, it's been 2.5 years since we implemented FlexiRamp and it still doesn't work. And it causes these problems.
Guillermo, I have a question for you as well. Since I know the onset of this was the intertie deviation settlement initiative, I'm curious if your team has identified which portion of this is specifically manual dispatches on the interties in comparison to the total exceptional dispatch amount, and if that has any impact, since I know some of the pricing we were originally looking at for the MSC opinion was pricing on the interties, and if a manual dispatch on the intertie does have some type of difference or impact to pricing in comparison to an exceptional dispatch of an internal generator.
Yeah. We have the information, and I can tell you that it's not a very persistent trend. It's more focused on specific days when you have large volumes, and this is part of the analysis and information we're going to be putting out. Yes.
It's Mark with Calpine. So when you manually dispatch the intertie, is that merely a real-time negotiated price, so there would be no bid cost recovery associated with it?
Now you're asking something that I may not be equipped to answer right now.
That's what used to happen.
About the settlement speed, yes.
That's what used to happen, is you would call BPA or somebody else and say, give me 500 megawatts now, and here's the price. So there would be no bid cost recovery. The only reason that I bring that up is because, and before I even say this, let me say thank you for looking into all this stuff, but I think Calpine has been seeking an exploration of the real-time price softness for years, and this seems like a diligent and comprehensive view of that. I appreciate that. One of the things that we have historically looked at is bid cost recovery, and BCR in real time seems to dominate all of the BCR that we see and have seen. And some of that could come from the exceptional dispatches. Some of that could come from price softness that's the result of the exceptional dispatches and manual dispatches. We really don't know. But BCR isn't really identified here. I realize that's the outcome and not the driver.
But may be a reflection of the dynamics of the market, yes.
Yeah, and it could be also related to unit commitments, or and then the resources don't recover. I think everything we've talked about shows up in those BCR numbers. So let me think about that a little bit more, and if I have some specific requests, I'll build them into our comments. Thanks, Guillermo.
Thank you, Mark. Okay. Now, these are the two big pockets, right? We want to analyze how changes in the demand side affect prices, clearing prices, but also on the supply side. In addition to these two big pockets, we do have other items that we want to take, and that has to do with the specific features and designs of our market. One of them, for instance, is the treatment of variable energy resources, and that has to do a lot with the timing, because they move too fast, and when you have these markets linked and just looking at different horizons and lookout periods, that alone is going to create a lot of divergence. In 30 minutes, for instance, when you move from the FMN market to the RTD market for the same time frame, 30 minutes in terms of RAM capability for variable resources means a lot. And we have seen that that is a big factor in here. And that is actually one of the reasons we try to go towards the accuracy of the forecast for renewable resources. But when you start talking about specific resources, I think the general pocket would be resource deviations. There has been extensive discussion about the intertie deviation when there are these partial declines or not shows. Well, that doesn't stop there. There are other type of resources that can indeed also deviate and create similar outcomes in the market. The key difference between interties and internal resources would be that the intertie, basically you have one-time opportunity to clear them, and once that opportunity is passed, there is nothing else to do for the interties. They are locked, they are fixed. For internal resources, there may be other resources that can still be moved internally at any frequency of the different markets. But still, the net effect that they are going to cause is the same. And what that is going to cause is this type of vicious cycle, because when you are an operator and you are sitting there trying to balance your system, you are going to see renewable resources deviating, moving too fast. On the other end, you are going to see, or you are going to be with a risk that you may have some ties not showing up. You may have other resources that you know are dragging to follow the instructions. And when you have to put all this together, all this type of deviations between what the market was projecting to have versus what actually is materializing, you have a gap, and that gap has to be true up. And this is typically when the operator actions have to take place, just to close that gap. So you create this cycle of deviation requiring action, and that action potentially having impact on price. Yes.
Steve Keene from Navigant. One question with that, isn't that what regulation is supposed to deal with? So how is it, I remember this we were discussing before, several years ago, how to deal with exceptional dispatch. One of the questions is, how much regulation do you have, and can you solve some of the problems by having more regulation?
Yeah.
Have you thought about that, or is that going to be in the analysis at all?
I think there are two components here. The first one has to do, actually, these two components have to be defined in terms of timing. Regulation really is to balance the supply by the second, right? You have, say, GC unit signals, and they have to reach the set point. This is just to naturally absorb the imbalances that are happening by the real time. When you are talking the frequency of 4 seconds to follow your AGC instructions, this is when regulation is used. That is why you need to have regulation. But there is no way a 5-minute interval dispatch is going to be able to react fast enough for these changes. That is the reason you have regulation. But when you have more persistent, longer time frames of these deviations, that is when you need to take other type of actions, because you cannot just lean on the whole regulation to be able to handle that. If you have, for instance, a cloudy day, right? You have a forecast that was projected to be 5,000 megawatts, and suddenly you have this cloud coming, and now you have 3,000 megawatts. Well, right there you have a hole of 2,000 megawatts. The regulation is going to be too little to absorb that in a sustainable fashion. It can absorb instantaneously what is happening, but you need to move your set point to a different place. And for that, you have to have exceptional dispatches, you have to have conformance, imbalance adjustment, you have to take other actions for the market in a longer time frame, reset the point where it needs to be.
But in that example you gave, I understand what you're saying, but the 5-minute, with the clouds coming over, shouldn't the 5-minute market start adjusting for that? Are you talking about the 2,000 megawatts? Would that drop in within 5 minutes, or is it in like 20 minutes, in which case the 5-minute market should be able to pick up some of it at least?
Yeah. This is a very good case to describe, because when you already run RTPD, that was 30 minutes before, right? Now you are dealing with a real-time dispatch, and you have to live with what the RTPD gave you. In RTD, you cannot just come magically with new resources committed, because it's too late. So by the time you were running RTPD, you didn't see the effect yet of the cloud coming, right? You have this projected amount of VR capacity. Now, 30 minutes later, you don't have it. Now your last resort is RTD. You cannot just instantaneously bring new units commitment into the market. You have to deal with what you have. That is another driver for operators, right? That they cannot be in the position to react just in the last minute. They have to project what is going to happen, and they can see the trends, and they have to go and proactively position the system to account for that to be coming. Yeah. Yes.
So what's the last period of time, or what process these are all, the previous slides were exceptional dispatches for Interties, right?
So for everything.
It says manual dispatch of Interties at supply to the market. So it's all exceptional dispatches, not just at the Interties?
Yes.
Okay, all right. But what's the last period of time or process that I think you're talking about that the Interties could be called upon for exceptional dispatches?
I think they may be called at any time. What typically is going to happen is that you are running the market. The first opportunity to see what you are going to get in the ties that are final is basically HAS, right? Most of the activity happens in HAS. We have very few 15-minute resources participating. So once you clear HAS, you have a very good idea how much interties you are going to get. That was the last opportunity for you to bring hourly resources through the market. After the HAS cleared, now operators know how much they are going to get if everything shows up, and they still have to handle the risk that they know some of that may not show up because that is one of the issues that we had. After that, the operators may take the action now to say, well, I feel I have too little interties. Now they can go into this manual dispatch of interties that is already past HASP for that specific hour. When, depending how fast the tagging and the negotiation takes place, the first time the tag may show up in the system typically going to be around the second interval of the hour in the FMM market. So if it's just taking too long, potentially you may also lose the second interval of the hour in FMM. Typically, we haven't seen that it doesn't show up in the third or fourth interval because it will be too late, right? And it has to do with the tagging time that is at least 20 minutes. For RTD, because you are running the market like 7.5 minutes in advance, typically every RTD interval of the hour is going to be able to see that energy already in the system.
This is Megan with the ISO. Just to add some context, Guillermo explained that exactly correct. But the manual dispatch process on the interties typically would happen immediately following the HASP result. So when the operator sees HASP and realizes, I didn't get as much on the interties as I was anticipating, they'll take that opportunity because this is a manual process and it takes time. Our operator has to actually call a trader. They have to agree on that price. It's typically at bid or better. The market participant then has to go and procure transmission, get an E-tag out there. So it typically takes about 20 minutes, and we still have to follow the NASB deadline, which is 20 minutes prior to the start of the hour. So T-minus 20 is the last opportunity to get a tag submitted to meet that manual dispatch agreement. So typically the process starts after HASP, and then it has to be concluded by T-minus 20. After that point in time, and that's where Guillermo was mentioning, our 15-minute market at that point has not recognized the E-tag submission. So the 15-minute market thinks we're short for the first 2 intervals of the operating hour. It then trues up for the last 2 intervals of the operating hour. Anything outside of that process would turn into what we call emergency assistance, and we truly would only call an emergency assistance if we're in an actual emergency situation, and that is very rare, does not happen frequently, and that process can happen at any time.
I want to focus on something that Megan and Guillermo said, that the operators are looking at what you clear in HASP and then saying that isn't enough. But HASP cleared based on their bid. We got everything they asked for. So this is a problem. There's a situation here that, we got to dig into about why this is happening, because you're getting everything you cleared and you wanted in HASP. So it isn't like, we thought we were hoping we were going to clear enough to cover demand, but we didn't, because HASP is going to clear enough to get demand. So, it's something more going on that is causing the operators to do that, and the fact that they do it after HASP causes part of our price formation problems, because if we did it in HASP, then everything would be consistent. So I think it's worth understanding what lies behind, what exactly is it that the operators didn't get in HASP, because they got the amount of supply that their load conformance was asking for.
Yeah, that's a good point, Scott, and I think that gets back to our chicken and the egg statement. So the operators on these really hot days are worried that there will be under-delivery on the interties, and in anticipation of under-delivery, they're going out of market. But the out-of-market process may actually suppress the real-time price, and the real-time price may further drive the non-delivery. So you end up in this vicious loop, especially on these hot days, and then there is the potential that traders recognize that if they call our operator, they might be able to get a higher price for that energy than what's clearing the market. So I think that there are some we need to figure out how to cut this cycle. And part of that, I think, will be ensuring delivery. If our operators have greater assurance that what is cleared in HASP is actually going to be delivered, that hopefully minimizes the need to do the manual dispatch process outside of the market.
Yeah, this is Brad. Just, Scott, to clarify your point, make sure we're understanding. I think what you're saying is, yeah, but if they think that, then why don't they adjust the HASP forecast, do it before HASP if they're going to think that. Right?
We're getting what we asked for in HASP. So if we don't like what we got, then we should have asked for it. Reverse. They should be worried if we get a lot of interties, then they should be worried. So if they get a lot of interties in HASP, then they should clear, it's a muddle here of what Maybe it's something about the procedures they have to go through, and they're not allowed to panic until they see the HASP results. But it really should be accounting for that in what we put in HASP. And
I think that's a good point, and my understanding, don't quote me on this, but my understanding right now is actually the manual dispatch, whether it happens before or after HASP, is not modeled in HASP. And I think that's an opportunity for growth. I think if we were to manual dispatch prior to the HASP run and then allow that to be reflected in the HASP clearing price, we would have something that is more accurate of what the operator is indicating. So I think that that's something we've been talking about internally, and I know that's something that our operators has asked for as well.
Okay, so we can take it.
Operator, can you put the question through on the phone, please?
Caller, please go ahead.
Good morning. This is Jeff Spires from PowerX. I just wanted to express our appreciation for this presentation. I think it really highlights a couple of things. One, just the number of factors that can impact the price, and also what appears to be the magnitude of some of these out-of-market actions, whether it's in RUC or exceptional dispatch or manual dispatch on the interties, all of which that can have a systemic impact on the prices. And of course, price formation is a critical topic. It's really important to us. So we support the discussion on this topic and trying to investigate in more detail what's driving some of these outcomes. But the other thing I just wanted to add is we also think it's important to engage with stakeholders on these topics in light of the day-ahead market enhancements and evaluating how future market design could potentially address some of these issues. We have ideas on that. We think others likely do too, and that having a robust discussion about what types of changes could be helpful to try to avoid some of these large out-of-market actions would be really beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. I'm sure Megan and Donna are going to be very excited to go after this. Okay. This slide is just to summarize what we have discussed. I think in the framework I try to give you is the explanation, the background of the areas that we feel that we need to tackle, and this just summarizes these big areas. Let me just go through this very quickly. The first part is obviously we need to have a meaningful set of metrics that can really show the dynamics of what we are doing. As I told you at the beginning, I'm not a very big fan of just using averages to draw conclusions because it hides too much information. So we need to first do a diligence to come with a very reasonable set of metrics that can shed light into what is happening, what are the dynamics happening in the system. The second part is going to be a set of metrics and start analyzing specifically what is happening with the divergence of the demand side, what the market is clearing against, with the inclusion of all the operators' adjustments. The other part is going to be obviously the effects on the supply side, all the changes that are happening on the supply, because again, supply meets demand, and if you change one of the other, it's going to have an effect on the clearing price. And the other item that we want to analyze specifically is the effect of the deviation of supply in general, not just about the interties that we have worked at length, but in general about the other type of resource deviations. And also, we expect to be able to tackle more specifically some market design and features that we have in the market, such as the logic that we have in HASP that may not apply for FMM, that may create some discrepancies between how we align the market. This is really what we want to do, and again, there is an opportunity to engage the discussion of what we want to do, what the scope of this analysis is going to be. We're going to have an open call with participants next week. We are also seeking for comments so that we can really memorialize your concerns and your requests so that we can really have an opportunity to shape the effort that we want to undertake. The last slide is basically just the timeline that we want to put in place. We don't want to take too long. Obviously, it's just never going to be done. We're expecting to have this completed by the end of July. We want to have a midpoint check that is going to be somewhere in June to see how we are doing, what methods we have, and again, take feedback from participants to see if we need to redirect the effort that we are taking on. So this is all what I have for this presentation. So I think we have one question here.
Hi, Guillermo. This is Callie Wells with WPTF. I actually have two questions now. So back on the last slide you were on, I was just curious if you guys have given any thought to including maybe a review of market transparency as one of the items in scope. I know that's not necessarily a quantitative analysis. It would be more qualitative, but looking at areas where you might be able to provide more information to market participants that then would help with price convergence between day ahead and real time.
Yeah. I would be a bit hesitant to open up this initiative to other factors just because of how fast you want to get this done, right? We can expand it to other areas that may not naturally fall into the area of price formation, price performance. That simply means it's going to dilute our effort to get this part done. So I hear you, and I understand transparency is also a big concern, but I would like to keep this more narrow in the terms of price performance.
And then my second question is, can you elaborate a little bit more in the paper between kind of your first report and your second report? It seemed like in the second report, that's where you're going to start folding in the price formation, kind of linking these initial metrics into price formation. I'm not sure if that gets to Colby's question he had earlier as to kind of once we get this initial report, are we going to then look at, okay, these are impacting price formation, and is it acceptable level, or kind of what is that link, and then from there, what's the plan now that we have these wonderful reports out? Are we going to open a stakeholder process to look at market changes if some are identified?
Yes, I think there will be actually two stages. The first one on its own is just the analysis that we have to undertake, right, to understand what's going on, what drivers are behind these price performance issues. That on its own is the whole effort that we are discussing here of analysis. After that, obviously, the natural question is going to be, what do you do now with these findings, right? That is going to take its own path to see whether we need to initiate a stakeholder process, whether we have just to change within the space that we can do changes right away. That is going to be a natural discussion that is going to be reached once we have this conclusion of this effort. Now, within the analysis effort, there are two stages. One is a midpoint touch, just to see how we are doing, to make sure that we have touched all the areas that we want to touch, come with all the metrics that we want to do. I would envision that for the second part, we want to take an approach of top-down. We want to start looking at the big picture, start boiling down into the specific elements. And my ultimate goal is going to be that we can be very targeted at the end to chase specific conditions, as simple as, okay, let's take this day that is so critical in terms of price formation. What if we have rerun the market without the exceptional dispatches? What would have been the clearing price? Really goes to the very little detail of why that outcome was happening in the market. And that is really the most painful part, because you really have to do one-by-one type of analysis. You have to go and check really how the solution play out, how you have to track different components of the market, rather than just coming with data analytics that tells you the story. You really have to spend the time analyzing specifically what happened in that market. So I'm expecting that type of effort is going to be for the second part once we have identified the key components that we have to go and nail down. Yes.
Dean Brooks, CDWR. You said the draft proposal for analysis was out on Wednesday. Can you add that to the list of documents for this meeting? Because I'm looking for it, but I don't see it. Or is this proposal your draft?
Yeah, I don't know. We can send the link in any means. It's posted on the website. We can figure out what the link is so that they can have access to that.
Thanks.
It's probably under the initiatives page under miscellaneous stakeholder initiatives, yes. I would guess. Yeah. So we don't post, the MSC meetings are separate from our stakeholder process, so we don't put all the materials on the MSC agenda or the web page.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, hi, Guillermo. Brian Baker with NRG. Thanks for this presentation. Let me echo my appreciation for you guys digging into this. I agree with Mark. It's been long overdue, and I want to thank the MSC for kind of catalyzing this so that it's moving. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to call in next week. I'm going to be traveling. So a general request I have, when you present information, and the ISO has got anything, it's got oodles of information, please present it in a way that, I share your distrust of averages. You know, they can be misleading. So when you put this together and think about presenting it to market participants, think about the best way to present the information that helps market participants understand what the impact on the markets is. That's my request of you.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Okay, that's all what I have for the first topic.
There was another hand. Nope. Okay. Anybody on the phone lines? Nope. Okay. So as a courtesy to the next speaker, oh, you're the next speaker. we should.
Let me take my shirt.
Yeah. Duck into a phone booth. Okay. So we'll immediately go to the next one, which is the CRR market analysis discussion. Of course, you know, last spring we went through. There was a lot of work done by the ISO and initiative to redo the auction. Now we have some results.
Okay. Let me go into this one. For some participants, this is not going to be completely new material because to some extent we have discussed this in the last Market Performance Forum back in February 20th or so. We have expanded to account for the results of February. I was hoping to have all the results inclusive of March, but just the timing of the meeting didn't play very well for that. By now we are getting those results, but it's just already too late for introduction here. So the March results are going to be presented in the upcoming Market Performance Forum meeting that is scheduled for, I believe, April 18 or so. Okay. A caveat here, the focus of this presentation is narrow in the performance of the second part of the changes that we did, mostly related to the settlements of the pro rata funding. This is really the content of the material. There will be some concepts, new definitions that may be not that familiar with, but this is the new word of the settlements, that is the CRR settlements based on a pro rata funding. And this trend, what shows you, is over the first 2 months, what has been the 3 new metrics, I would say, that we can track on performance of CRRs. The first one is what we call the notional value. That is the full no pro rata funding of CRRs. Based on the award, based on the clearing prices of the day-ahead market, what is the worth of those CRRs? The nominal value, what we call the notional value. Then the second bar is what we call offset revenue. That offset revenue can be positive or negative. And the offset is no more than the delta between what you collect of congestion rents in the market and what you have to pay as CRR payouts at nominal value. A positive value means you have additional rent that you collected in the day-ahead market that didn't have to be exhausted to pay the CRRs. A negative value means it's a dollar figure in which you came short to balance what you have to pay for CRRs based on your funding from the day-ahead market. And this is a key component because this is the whole foundation of the new settlements rule. The last bar, the adjusted revenue, is no more than the difference between the notional value and the offset, as long as that offset is negative. Because part of the rules that we have now is that you keep track separate from the surplus and the deficit. And there are more rules. For instance, if you have a surplus in 1 hour and a deficit in another hour by constraint, you can net those out. But if you have a surplus in one constraint and a deficit in another constraint, they are not netted. So there will be cases where you have actually a surplus, and that is not going to make an effect on the notional value. This is just set aside. Effectively, only the offset revenue that is negative, that is a deficit, is going to reduce the value of the CRR portfolio. And obviously, you can see the trend that in February, we have way more congestion than what was observed in January. Let me go through these different metrics. This accounts for the first 2 months. Each month is in one specific color, and we have 5 different metrics. The first one is the CRR notional value, how much we have to pay for CRRs based on the day-ahead clearing prices. The difference between the blue and the green bar just tells you the amount of CRR payments we have to make at face value. The second set of metrics is what we call the CRR deficit, is the negative offset that we have in the system. For January, it was very small. For February, it was in the range of $9 million. That is a deficit that was accrued for the whole month. That is the deficit that has to be pro rata adjusted to the portfolios of CRR because that is money that we didn't have. And again, it goes through the logic of doing this by constraint, by CRR portfolio, and so on. But in general, that is a picture that for February, we had a deficit of about $9 million. So if you take the first set of bars with the second set of bars, what you get is the adjusted value. Once we've internalized and allocated the deficit that we experienced for February, what you get in the third set is effectively what is going to be paid to participants based on their portfolio. It's the adjusted value of the CRRs. As I indicated, this is one picture, taking into account internalizing the deficits that happen for CRRs. Separate from that, we keep track of the surpluses. The surpluses go into a balancing account and they are not touched to offset the deficits, they are just separated. And for both months, we have some level of surplus in the CRR market. Obviously, February was more meaningful given the amount of congestion that we have in the system. This CRR surplus is one component of what makes up what we call the balancing account. The balancing account is the final mechanism that we have to collect all the money that at the end of the day is going to be allocated to measure demand. The other two components are basically the auction revenues, the proportion of the seasonal auction revenues for that month plus the auction revenues for the corresponding month from the monthly auction. So the surplus plus the auction revenues is what make up the balancing account, and that gives you a size of how much money is going back to measure demand, because now this is an excess of money that we have through the settlements of the CRRs. For February, that exceeded the $10 million, and again, this goes back to measure demand. When we are talking about the pro rata funding, at the end of the day, we have a value of deficit. That deficit has to be pro rata allocated to the different portfolios based on the contribution that they have to that deficit. Different participants are going to see different levels of adjustment based on their contribution of their portfolios into the deficit. So it's not going to be just a spread barrier pro rata, it's based on the contribution they have into the specific deficit. And when you put this all together for all constraints at the portfolio level, you can see the before and after. How much was the notional value, how much is the adjusted value, and from there you can just get a very simple ratio, right? What is the adjusted portfolio for each scheduling coordinator, for each CRR holder? This plot is one for each month, and what it's telling you is what is the adjusted value of the portfolio. 80% means the notional value has to be in total for the portfolio, be adjusted by 20% down, and effectively they are getting paid 80% of the face value of the portfolio. And you can keep going. Obviously, on the left-hand side, you have 100%. Those that somehow didn't have any contribution or effect into the deficit, they didn't get allocated any deficit. Their value is the face value, the notional value. And you go to the other end of the spectrum, and you start getting lower and lower rates, because simply there is more and more allocation of the deficit to those portfolios. At some point, in some circumstances, these values can actually flip, and what it actually means is that if there was a position of a CRR portfolio that, let's say, originally the notional value was to get paid $100, given the deficit allocation, now it flips and is charged X amount of dollars. That is going to be reflective in the negative values just because it's flipping the position of that portfolio. And obviously, the percentage alone doesn't give you the full picture because you may be dealing with very large portfolio, volume-wise, versus very small portfolios. The other metric that you have in the plot, that is the bars in green, tells you the size of the deficit allocated to that portfolio, just to give you the sense of the magnitude of the adjustment. In this case, you can see that, for instance, in January, right, if you see the negative ones, the ones that flip position, you are talking about very tiny dollars that actually play a role for flipping that portfolio. It really means it's a very small portfolio. We're talking about some dollars. Different when you see February, for instance, that it became more significant. I cannot really see the numbers, but I think it's in the range of $400,000 when you see the adjustment of the deficit. So again, this is just to give you a sense of how the pro rata adjustment is playing out for the different portfolios of the market. Yeah, we can take it.
Operator, can you put the question through, please?
Caller, please go ahead.
Mike Raymond from Boston Energy. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Mike.
Just one question on slide 3. Does the surplus values and the negative offset values, do they incorporate the monthly allocation of surpluses, or is that not included in your numbers?
It is included. This is the final balancing. So we have this daily balancing that can just net deficits and surplus through the day. But then at the end of the month, we come back and basically reset all this to make sure that if there is any netting needed between different hours of different days on the same constraint, that takes place. So this value that you see here is the total. It's not just the daily, it's not just the monthly, it's the total, the daily and the monthly figure. It's the final value.
Great, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yes, Callie.
This is Callie Wells with WPTF again. So earlier this week there was a call talking about CRR settlements and how they're going to be recalculating. So I was curious, I'm assuming these are not the recalculated values. Do you anticipate these trends significantly changing once those recalcs occur, or what are your thoughts on that?
My sense is that these issues that we discussed in the settlements call early this week are going to have an effect, but not to the point where this is going to be materially different, because it's very targeted to some specific locations. And the values that are reflected in these metrics are the values that we generated when we originally ran the process. So if there are any cleanup reruns that have been done, they are not reflected here yet. Yes, Brian.
Yeah, Guillermo, thank you. Brian Baker. The February graph, the right-hand side is pretty interesting. Is there any floor with regard to the flip of the CRR position? And if not, how does the ISO ensure that that position is properly collateralized?
Yeah, I would say there is no explicit floor because it depends on the deficit. And this is one of the dynamics that happens when you have to target this calculation by constraint. So there is no explicit floor where you can hit it. Indeed, I just put a floor here of, I believe, 200%, but it could be actually lower than that.
So, I mean, the second question, maybe you don't know, maybe it's quite a question for the credit folks, but I mean, it seems like it would pose a collateral risk. I know that flipped positions have been a topic of discussion in PJM.
And we're under discussions currently for the credit requirements, so we are looking into this.
This is Perry. So I'll just add that they do adjust those collateral requirements every day based on each CRR's position on that day.
This is just to give you a trend of what constraints are causing the congestion rent, and there are other metrics at the end in the appendix that tells you how much of the deficit is accrued on the different constraints. And this goes by flow gates, by interties, by nomograms, etc. And just to give you the sense of where the congestion is being collected and where the congestion is being paid. And again, the whole genesis of this new methodology is that it's done on a constraint-by-constraint basis. So we have all this granularity at the constraint level. And this naturally is going to show you that February in general saw a large amount of congestion with respect to January. When it comes to the surplus, this is something I already explained, but this just gives you the specific numbers. At the end of the month, when we do the final settlement and the final true-up of the month, we are going to have this specific balancing account that tracks all the surpluses accrued through the settlements of the CRRs. One component is the natural surplus that happens when we settle on the constraint level, and the other two components are going to be the auction revenues coming from the annual and the monthly process. When you put these three pieces together, that is what gives you the size of the money that is allocated to measure demand. That is the balancing account neutrality. And for the month of January, it was about $7.4 million, and for February is in the range of $12 million. Again, this is the final dollar value that goes back to measure demand. Similar in the spirit to what we used to do prior to this implementation of the pro rata funding. Now, this is a slightly different angle of the metrics, and what I'm trying to compare here is just to give you a reference of how things have changed. There are two plots, one for each month, but there is a comparison between the blue and the green bars. And that comparison is basically the before and after the implementation of the pro rata funding. That is, if we take the bars in blue, that is going to give you a measure of what would have been the settlement if we don't have any pro rata funding for January and February. If you see the bars in green, is basically the metrics that we currently have under the implementation of the pro rata funding. So how different has been the pro rata funding playing for January and February in comparison to the old-fashioned approach. And you can see that for these two specific months, there are some interesting facts. First, the first set of bars is the congestion rent. That doesn't change with or with the pro rata funding. It's just the money that we collect from the day-ahead market. That is the same before and after. The second part is actually the CRR payments. That is going to change because now that we have the pro rata funding, those CRR payments are going to be adjusted to the level that we can fund those through the congestion rent. Now, don't expect that the first bar is equal to the second bar because the surplus and the deficits are kept separate, so they may be different. What shows you here, at least for February, that is more meaningful, you can see that the CRR payments were in the range of almost $40 million, and then with the pro rata funding, it drops to about $30 million. So in the old-fashioned settlements, we would have fully funded to the extent of $40 million. Now, with the new rule, we bring it down to $30 million. That is effectively what we are going to pay to CRRs. The third metric maybe is the most interesting one. That is, what is the revenue adequacy before and after the pro rata funding logic? If we wouldn't have the pro rata funding, you can see that for January, we would already be in surplus. Even with no pro rata, we would have enough money collected to pay all the CRRs. When you see the same picture for February, we would be off in a deficit by almost $1 million. So if we were to implement full funding for CRR, we would be in a deficit of $1 million. If now you compare this third bucket in comparison to the green bar, you are going to see the effect of the pro rata funding. In the 2 months, actually, that increased. So we have a better revenue adequacy, obviously, because we have allocated deficit that otherwise would have been offset with potential surplus in the market. That is really the comparison of the before and after logic of having this new settlement rule in place. And the last set of the metrics will just tell you, at the end of the day, what would have been the money that goes back to measure demand at the end of the settlement cycle for CRRs. If we wouldn't have the pro rata funding, just full funding, the value that you would get, let's say, for February would be less than $5 million. with the pro rata adjustment now under the new paradigm, the amount of dollars that go back to measure demand exceeds the $10 million. That is the net effect of having this new logic in place.
Hey, Guillermo, this is Perry. I just want to clarification from you. You've combined both January and February numbers here. This isn't January or February separately. This is the money from both January and February. And
no, the upper plot is January, the lower plot is February.
I see.
Yeah.
Guillermo, so maybe I'm just missing the definitions here, but the CRR payments column for February is greater than the total congestion rents. Are there some negatives in there that I'm missing?
Let me see. You mean
the two blue bars?
This bar is lower than this bar. Right. This is under the paradigm if we have full funding, right? We collected just about $36 million of congestion rate.
Okay, so that's the revenue shortfall.
But we have to pay about $40 million. That means we are about $1 million off, short.
Right, okay.
That is with no pro rata funding. With the pro rata funding, we correct that piece now, and what you see in the green bars is effectively what is happening now for January and February. This is just a what-if scenario if we didn't have the pro rata funding in place.
Okay, I see that now. So one thing that I would be interested to see, going back to sort of that distribution, is how the CRR by CRR haircut would look under alternative allocation assumptions.
Yes, I have some metrics at the end of the presentation that, in an aggregate fashion, can give you some color on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Operator, can you put the question through, please, on the phone?
Caller, please go ahead.
Hey, Guillermo, Mike Kramick from Boston Energy again. Question on this slide. Have you dug into the drivers of surpluses? Is it because capacity is going unsold in the auction, or is it because there's transmission limit changes between what was cleared in the auction versus what was actually secured in the day ahead? Have you gotten into that level of detail to identify what's driving some of these surpluses? And obviously some constraints, but not all.
Yes, we have been looking at those. We have been looking at the alignment between the CRR market and the day-ahead market. And I think the next two slides will give you some flavor of some dynamics that we have found. And in general, I think we can give more color once we complete the first quarter, and then we can elaborate in terms of the potential misalignments of day-ahead versus CRRs in terms of the transmission limits and modeling that we have. We just have to collect everything for the first quarter.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Just to answer your question, we are looking into that, and we have some information. So this is actually a good venue to move into the next slide, because naturally this will be the type of question we're going to get now that there is more visibility of what's going on in the settlements of the CRR market that also transpires into what's going on in the day-ahead market. There are two slides, and each one is for different constraints. And this looks spotty, but this is how the market actually cleared. It was just in some hours of each day. That is the reason it's not continuous. It's just showing the hours when it's binding. And there are three lines here. Three sets of points. And the first one is the upper one, that is a dotted line that we define as the IFM clear value. This is the limit that we use and enforce in the day-ahead market. And if it is binding, obviously we hit that limit. The line or the dots in blue are what we call the IFM estimated flows. These are the flows that we estimate of using injection times shift factors. These two values are not going to be always the same. You may have a constraint that is binding, but the IFM estimated flow, that is indeed the flow that we use to collect congestion rents, can be somewhere different to that value. And before I go into explaining why that happened, let me just introduce the third line. That is the CRR flow. This is the estimated flow using the shift factors and the CRR definitions into the CRR settlement that we have. That is basically the flow on which we have to pay the congestion revenue rights. Now, ideally, we would like to see the red and the blue lines somehow in the same place, because that basically means we are aligning the day ahead with the CRR market. The main item that this picture brings to the surface is that there is a delta between the green line, that is the limit that we enforce and that we bind in the day ahead market, versus how much money we collect on the estimated flow of the day ahead market. The reason for this to happen is twofold, and it could be one or the other or a combination of both. One is basically telling us that there is capacity on the specific element in the day-ahead market that is not optimizable. What does this mean? Let me take the first flavor. When we expand the full network model into our market back in 2014, now we have the visibility of what's going on in the whole area of our system, not just the CAISO footprint, but also in the adjacent areas. Now we have this full visibility of the AC network model. We wanted to make sure that to some extent we account for the effect of injections happening somewhere else in the system that at the end of the day may introduce unscheduled flows in our system. In that implementation, we came with something, a placeholder, a reference of how much we have to model what's going on in the other systems. And we bring this concept of taking into account some base reference of how much is being dispatched, scheduled in the other balancing areas. These schedules, this generation is going to potentially have an effect on the flows on our transmission system. So one of these contributors for this delta between what we actually enforce in the day-ahead market versus what we actually clear and collect money on has to do with this capacity that is not optimizable in the day-ahead market because it's taking a space from these contributions elsewhere in the system. So if you have a very big injection somewhere in the northern part of the system, we know some of that is going to be on a scheduled flow that is going to flow through the backbone of the system. Well, we're trying to capture that through the basis schedules of the full network model, and that is going to take a space of that transmission element. And therefore, the remaining capacity is going to be that is actually optimizable through the dispatches of the market. That capacity, by the time it takes that space of the line, is going to basically be capacity that cannot collect congestion rents because it's not optimizable. That is the reason that you are going to have the blue line and the green line to be potentially different, because that is one of the effects. A similar effect has to do with taking into account the contributions of specific injections on the constraint that happen to fall below the 2%. We have a shift factor threshold that we impose in the market, day ahead and real time, of 2%. If there is an injection that has an association of a shift factor that is less than 2%, effectively doesn't play a role in the congestion management, doesn't see the congestion effect. When we clear the day ahead market and we take into account the full network model and the full power flow, we take every single contribution, including those that are under the 2%, because it's just the power flow. When we come into the market side, the scope side, we now impose the 2% threshold, and this may create this gap. These two components are going to effectively take away some capacity on the transmission element, and therefore may result in collecting less than the nominal capacity of the transmission element. And I can tell you, it can play either way. Those basis schedules can actually reduce the capacity that is optimizable in the day-ahead market, but it could actually potentially provide counterflows and therefore release more capacity than the physical capability of the transmission element. This is what gives you the visibility of what is being collected in the day-ahead market, how much is paying the CRR in terms of flows.
So, okay, I've seen this picture now for a while and still working my head through it. And each time I have more questions. So, first of all, each vertical slice here is an hour? Is that how?
The granularity is hourly, but just shows a value when it's binding.
When there is congestion?
Yes.
So does that mean there should be the same number of dots for each of these three colors? Because it looks like the green looks like dots, whereas the blue and the red look like continuous lines.
And actually,
that's the formatting thing?
The formatting thing, indeed, the green is dotted line. It should be just a dark line to be in the same basis, but it's dotted, so with that you may lose some granularity there.
I see. Okay, so there aren't any. I was wondering if there were some moments where green actually drops down to blue and they're on top of each other, but pretty much. And if you stare at this, I mean, this is a big difference. So it's almost 1,000 megawatts of extra flow that is. And when you say unscheduled, I guess I'm thinking this is external to CAISO, loop flow through the west kind of.
Yes.
And loss flows too, right?
And losses, okay. And I guess the other thing that surprises me, so how is that sort of thing represented in the CRR auction itself, if at all?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the spirit is always to align the market, right? The same limit, the same capacity that you made available in one market should be in the other market. The challenge with this is, again, the granularity. And we went through this discussion, right? Because the base scales can change as frequently as hourly in the model that we have in the day-ahead market. And they can vary widely from 1 hour to the other. When you have to come to the model of the CRR market, that is a granularity of as fine as monthly, what value do you use? If you have all these variations through the month and you have to take a value to model in the CRR, the question is going to be what that value is going to be and how we can justify it. Instead of trying to model explicitly a reduction of the capacity, that in some cases actually is additional capacity, not just prevailing flow reduction, but it could be counter flow. We stay in the safe course of we have this global derating factor that somehow brings every single element down. We lean on that factor to say, well, generally, let's say if that is enough to account to some extent indirectly for the capacity that is lost through these unscheduled flows.
Okay, so it's that derating where, remind me again, the seasonal auction is down to 50%, or where did that?
Well, actually, that is slightly different. This is just how much capacity we release in the annual process. But what I'm referring is that even if you are going to release the total capacity in a process, we have this global derating factor to prorate the capacity that is released.
Okay, so you derate the capacity and then you release only a fraction of that derated capacity.
Yes. Okay. And that rating factor applies, I believe, only to the monthly process. That is the final process to release the CRR. And this is like a placeholder to try to absorb this variation because we don't have a very good reference what value we should put. And this can go as granular by constraint, right? So you have to go start targeting constraint by constraint. Some of those, like the ones in Southern California, are going to be more meaningful, but simply speaking, is the full range of constraints that you may have to analyze. So in that granular approach, we rely on the global derating factor to do some type of justice.
Given all that, it's kind of remarkable that the red and blue are that close to each other. Because I think if you didn't do any derating, the concern would be you sell the green, and you're losing so much capacity to unscheduled flow, at least on this one constraint, that you could be in real trouble. But here, the red, I mean, it's off, but it's a lot closer to blue than it is to green. So all this derating has gotten you in the ballpark, at least. And I guess my other question was how representative this one constraint would be, but it sounds like there's going to be some where it goes the other way. Is this self-selected to be a notably large one, or is this kind of a random
one because how large it is, how meaningful it was.
Now, for the brown or red, the CRR flow, we have the same CRRs over the month, and we've got the same loop flow model, the same loss model, so the only difference is that the shift factors are varying day to day.
Yes. Okay, and the same logic and explanation goes to the second slide. It's just a different constraint. different dynamics, different outcomes. Maybe the values are different. In this case, the constraint is in the range of 300 megawatts. The effect is still there, and it could be potentially for any other constraints.
So, Guillermo, the right-hand side, the constraint, the amount of capacity is the same in each of these binding hours. We have a straight line for the dots on top. So in the previous slide, the amount of capacity varied from hour to hour. Is that because of, N-1 or other security constraints or changing hour to hour?
It could be more than one reason. One reason is that when we have a limit in the day-ahead market, you have a limit that is typically in MVA. Is the full thermal capacity of the element, and this is a thermal constraint. The first part that we do through the optimization is to go and solve the network model side, the power flow. From there, you effectively have to reduce the MVA and convert it to a megawatt. That alone, the reactive component, is going to change over time the limit. The second factor could be that very well we adjusted the limit to some extent manually to account for conditions that we have in the system. It could be either factor or both.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Operator, can you put the question through, please?
Caller, please go ahead.
Hey, Guillermo, this is Seth with DC Energy. Thanks for putting these together. Between these two slides, what is having more of an impact, the impact of loop flows or the 2% shift factor cutoff?
I wish I could have a very scientific answer for that. There is no data point that I can just dissect the components, unless we have to go and try to rerun the market without one of the components. So it's all mashed up, and there is no way we can separate just based on the data that we have available.
Why do we have a shift factor cutoff? Is that for computational ease or?
Yes, I think this goes back to day one of the MRTU in 2009, and one of the main concerns was the performance, right? You start having shift factors below the 2%, and you start handling that, the performance may be impacted. And I think in the recent years there was some discussion to see if that percentage could be reduced, but as of now it's still 2%.
This is Mark Roth. I think there's two reasons why we did the 2% shift factor threshold. One is the amount of shift factors. If you let it go all the way down to 0 or near 0, the size of the shift factor file becomes very, very large. We have to continue that all the way through the systems. The second reason was there was a concern that if you go down below 2% threshold, you may get some very ineffective movements on resources, and this was an operational concern, on resources very far away from the constraint that are not very effective. Reality is that the constraint relaxation parameter would eventually kick in and prevent some of that, but there was nonetheless that concern.
The other problem with the second concern is the effectiveness depends on the difference in the shift factors between your moving up and down, and this shift factor is relative to the reference bus, so it's completely irrelevant to that concern.
Yeah. Okay. The second part of the metric that I have in this presentation has to do with an extra step we have taken to analyze further the performance of the CRR logic. And just to bring you back to the reference, the new logic that we have in place works at the constraint level and works at the portfolio level. When we determine the deficit of the offset, it's always at the portfolio level. Obviously, to be able to reach that part through the calculation of the settlement, we have to go and see what was the effectiveness of each CRR and the contribution that it had on the deficit. But the numbers that come out of the process are at the constraint and portfolio level. And that portfolio doesn't really tell you very much of information when you want to analyze specific CRRs because it's the whole portfolio, right? And if there are participants with hundreds of CRRs, it's not very meaningful to analyze the portfolio as a whole. What we have done to be able to do more analysis on the performance of this is to go one step further to what is currently provided through the settlements, and that is we have a notional value, a deficit value, a surplus value, and an adjusted value at the portfolio level by constraint. What we have to do is basically work our logic back to be able to associate or allocate that notional deficit surplus adjusted value to the individual CRR. We have to disaggregate now from the portfolio. First, we go from CRRs into portfolio, aggregating to get the effect. Now, for this analysis, we have to go all the way back and disaggregate it again to see the specific effect on each CRR. And this has to take some assumptions of how we do that disaggregation. In general, I can tell you that the way we disaggregate the effect at the portfolio level into specific CRRs basically is following the spirit of the first logic that we have to do the pro rata funding. That means only prevailing flow CRRs get a portion of the deficit. If you have counter flows in the portfolio, they don't get any pro rata allocation of the deficit. And the metrics that we have here are narrowly focused only to tackle the obligation CRRs. There are some option CRRs, but they are not effectively participating in the market. They are more merchant type of CRR options. So we just put them aside to not introduce that noise.
They're very small.
Megawatt-wise, yes. For February, we saw that the dollar value is relatively meaningful, given where they are located and where the congestion happened in the system. And obviously, this is based on data that we currently have available, and as you may have heard earlier, we have some cleanup that we have to do, so potentially these metrics may change. To some extent, I don't expect that it's going to be quite meaningful in change. So the first part is, well, we have all these new metrics that we have to put in context for the performance of the CRR market. The first set of metrics that you have here is the breakdown by type of CRR. We have the notional value, how much originally we have to pay at full value, then how much we have to claw back in terms of the deficit, what is the effective adjusted value once we take into account and internalize the deficit, and then the surplus of the settlement process, how much we get. All what it tells you here is just the breakdown across the different types of CRR. And in general, you can see in the ballpark that the settlement-wise was halfway for auction CRRs and halfway for allocation CRR. For auction, you just have one bar. For allocation, you have 3-4 different flavors just because of the nature of the CRRs that we have in the system for the allocation processes. And that would be the takeaway from this metric. Overall, the settlements was halfway for auction and for allocation CRRs.
I have a suggestion that you're going to hate. And maybe it's just not practical, but so this is the result of an auction that has already changed quite a bit relative to the previous auctions, limiting the eligible
the new policy
sync source pairs and such. And in a way, it's made the set of CRRs available in the auction much more comparable to those available in the allocation process than before. It'd be interesting to know sort of whether this kind of chart would be as comparable across the allocation and auction if we had not made the change to the auction as well. Mm-hmm. And one thought about trying to do that is to take a previous year's sort of set of of auctioned CRRs mm-hmm. and assume that, let's say those same sync source pairs and quantities were in place during January, February of 2019. Mm-hmm. Would they have taken substantially greater haircuts or less or something like that? So that's why I said you would hate it. Because I'm just trying to think about how much of this result is due to, was there all along, or how much of it is due to the fact that we did make those changes to the auction rules as well. And off the top of my head, that's one thought as to how to get at that. But
Well, let me think about it. Okay, this other metric is also an index that we have used in the past discussions when we were through the policy phase. And what this is comparing is the dollar figure of what we have to pay to auction CRRs and how much money was collected from those CRRs in the auction processes. Basically, how much comes in, how much goes out, only for the pool of CRRs that belong to the auction processes. And each plot is for a month. You have January and February. And you can see that in general, the pro rata funding is going to naturally reduce the notional value. That is going to bring down the dollar that we have to pay to CRRs. And when you compare the two metrics, what you're going to see is the net effect or the improvement of this ratio between what was paid to get the CRR versus what is paid by owning that CRR. And for January, I think it moved from 77% to 80%. And you may recall in the discussions we have during the policy phase that we were talking about in the range of $50 on the cent or $60 on the cent. February looks quite different in this case because it's in the lower end of the spectrum. I think it's still an improvement when you impose the pro rata funding, but you can see the ratio move very little from 20 plus to the low 30%. And this is quite meaningful given the amount of congestion that we have for February. And I think all these metrics are still, I would say, too early to draw a conclusion how we are performing once we just implemented the new policies and are evaluating just a couple of months.
Yeah, I think it's important we keep in mind looking at this sort of thing that especially if February was sort of a surprisingly high amount of congestion, well, you would expect to see high CRR payouts relative to the expected CRR payouts and therefore relative to the auction price. So whenever you look at the realized values, it doesn't necessarily reflect what the correct expectation going in would have been.
Yeah. Just a second, I thought when we were talking about this before that the CRR payment was the total payouts to allocated and auction CRRs, right?
This specific metric only tackles auction CRRs.
Auction. Okay.
Only auction CRRs.
Hey, Guillermo?
Yes, sir.
Maybe I missed it, but did you go over, do you have an idea of why the congestion increased in February?
We have, yes, we have first conditions that exacerbated the congestion. You may recall in February we have these gas price spikes and so on. So naturally, when you have higher marginal fuel prices, the congestion that may be even the same from different months is going to be priced more expensively, right? That is one single factor at play. But we also have constraints that came in the system, and that were basically El Casco constraints. There was an outage in the area. We have to impose nomograms. That nomogram indeed was modeled in the auction for the month of February. It was not modeled because this was known by September. So it was not on time for the annual auction, but it was on time for the monthly auction. So these two factors really is what caused a higher level of congestion in the system. Yes.
Hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. So during the policy process, one of the concerns we had was that you're introducing this new risk with how CRRs are being settled. So market participants in the auction might price that risk into their bids, which would then in turn reduce the revenues in the auction. Have you guys, I know 2 months, doesn't necessarily establish a trend, especially with high congestion in February, but have you guys looked into that at all, or do you plan on looking into how it might impact the bids?
Do you mean, Kelly, whether the auction revenues might be considerably lower? That would be your hypothesis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's the question. So what do we know about auction revenues for price for those 2 months versus?
Yes, and I realize now that I didn't put too many metrics, or actually no metrics about the auction results. And we do have something. We saw a drop of the auction revenues for both the annual and the monthly. I think for the month of February is in the range of $4.5 million. For the month of January, totally was about $7 million, I believe. When you see the trend in comparison to previous years, we do see a drop of the auction revenues. And let me caveat that as well, because obviously the volumes of CRRs that were traded and sold in the auction dropped significantly as well.
Yeah, you can kind of eyeball the auction impact on slide 7, the gap between the third and fourth columns, where you're basically adding that in.
Yeah.
I think there's the impact on the auction element itself, and then there's also just the impact on how much additional risk these new CRRs are creating relative to the old CRRs. That's kind of why I was curious about the distribution under different allocation rules.
Okay.
Guillermo, just one question.
Yes.
Steve, you said that you saw a drop in February of about $4.5 million in the revenue?
No, what I mentioned is that there is a trend of dropping auction revenues after implementing the new policies. You compare previous year versus this year, you can see that there is a reduction, right? There is a new reference line, basically.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay. The last 3 slides cover somehow the same information from a different angle. And this is really trying to cover one specific feature that comes along with the implementation of the pro rata funding and the logic that we actually use for the pro rata funding. And that is, you may have one CRR with same definition, point A to point B. That CRR, depending where it sits, whether it's with portfolio A, with portfolio B, is going to have potentially a different valuation. Even though it's the same definition, same CRR, just by the fact that it belongs to a different portfolio, because of the way we have the pro rata funding that goes by portfolio specifically, the deficit that you allocate to different CRR, to different portfolios, even for the same CRR, is going to put a different value to the same CRR definition. So these 3 slides go to the top CRRs that had a surplus, to the top CRRs that have a deficit, and the most traded CRRs. And what you have here is a box whisker plot, just to tell you the range of variation in the value of the CRRs once we have implemented the deficit allocation through the pro rata funding. Is this the first one? Yeah. So this first one is the CRR with a surplus. Overall, they have a surplus. But still, because the deficit and the surplus are tracked separately, there may be some adjustment to those portfolios, to those CRRs, and depending what proportion they got allocated of the deficit, now their value is different. These are basically telling you that if you take, for instance, this CRR that is in position about position 20, it's telling you, depending where it belongs to, some CRR for the same definition may have a value close to 100%. Depending on who else may have that same CRR, it may be possible that that same CRR has a valuation of about now 45%. And that, again, is a spread based on the allocation that we do, based on the logic that we have for the pro rata funding. If you go now with the top CRR based on the amount of deficits they accrue, you can see that the range can be sometimes even wilder than that. And if you go with the most traded CRRs, and traded may be deceiving, I really mean CRRs that were participating or cleared in the auction or allocation. All what I'm taking is away all the little CRRs that we have for the low migration, the counter flows, and just leave alone the allocation and auction CRRs. These are the most traded, or the ones that occur the most during the process.
Guillermo, just so we understand, so each vertical slice here is an individual sync so it's a sync source pair, not a constraint.
Yes. It's one same CRR definition.
And the x-axis, number 1 would be the most megawatts?
Depending on the metric, for instance, this is the most traded one. This will be, the number 1 will be the CRR with that was allocated or auctioned the most across the participants.
In terms of megawatts?
In terms of frequency, how many times the same CRR was allocated or traded, right? Let's say you have a CRR, regardless of the megawatt, it is definition A to B. There may be 100 different CRRs from different portfolios that have that same CRR, regardless of the megawatt quantity. It's just what was the most frequently used CRR in the process.
Okay, so, all right, so the first one might, if there are 70 portfolios altogether, first one might be 65 out of 70, and then it goes down from there.
Yes. I can tell you, it's not that a great number. I think when I check one of those, I think the most traded one was like 10 times. Okay, I think that's all what I have for this part. I don't know if there are any questions on the phone or...
Not on the phone.
Okay.
All right. So let's see, we're at lunchtime now. Let me just make sure there are no further questions or comments in the room or from the MSC about this presentation. We look forward to seeing results for future months. This is obviously, 2 months is a small sample, but it will be, of course, interesting to see if once you add in payments to allocated rights, plus auction revenues, plus surplus, whether that's improving, at least from the point of view of DMM's metrics in terms of how much money is retained by ratepayers. But I'm glad we have these at least initial results for the 2 months.
Yeah, I think once we complete the full first season, we can come with the metric. I think we were just doing that mental exercise the other day, and I think it was much closer than what it used to be. Because I think for February, for instance, just to throw numbers there, total consolidation rent is about, 40 million. Out of those, 18 million were for auction CRRs. That leaves 22 million for allocation CRRs. And if you add about $12 million of the surplus and the auction revenues, that puts you at $30+ million in comparison to the 40 million. Is close to be in the ballpark.
This would be the last bar on, is it slide 11? Or
sorry, what is that?
I'm sorry, I'm looking at an old draft. the four sets of bars pro ratified. Slide 7?
I don't know if it remains the
that
same.
One.
Yeah.
So you're adding that to the right-hand bars.
Well, I guess we could do the math.
Comparing that to the congestion rate.
Yes. 22 to the last green bar.
That'd be 22 plus 13. That you'd be 35 versus congestion rents of about 38.
Yeah.
Okay. That's an interesting number as well. Okay. Look forward to seeing numbers for future months.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Guillermo. Now you have lunchtime to rest and recover before you're on yet again. So let's see. We were scheduled to end at 12:15. Let's give an hour for lunch, unless we think we should be try to be on time.
You're good.
Okay. So we'll get back together here at 1:30. Okay. So operator will take an hour and 5-minute break for lunch and. See you all back here then. Okay. Great.